Hello and welcome to the first proper episode of the Every Voice Matters podcast, where no political opinion is silenced and all views are given fair and equal footing. Today we will be discussing differing views over the current and previous set of protests that have taken place this year over America. The format for this and for future episodes will be a quick contextual description, followed by presenting both sides and then a comparison at the end. I will not be seeking to prove that either side is right, and the purpose of this podcast is merely to convey different views of this situation on an equal level. So I won't be going into much detail about the context itself. It's not a news podcast, it's also not an opinionated podcast, it's just showing different opinions. Regarding the context, firstly we will look at the death of George Floyd and then the shooting of Jacob Blake. We will only be focusing on these two, and while there are other situations such as the shooting of Breonna Taylor, these, I believe, have been the most impactful in essentially starting protests. So regarding George Floyd, on the 25th of May, following a suspected counterfeit bill being used to buy cigarettes, police were called to a store where George Floyd was. They arrived and a police officer called Thomas Lane ordered Floyd to show his hands at gunpoint and pulled George Floyd out of his car, and then when trying to put Floyd into the police car, he fell to the ground saying he was claustrophobic, and it's reported that around about the same time was when the police officer Derek Chauvin arrived. Floyd was placed on the ground and Chauvin put his knee on Floyd's neck. He continued to place his knee on Floyd's neck while the man pleaded with the famous quote, "I can't breathe." His knee was on Floyd's neck for a reported 8 minutes and 46 seconds, although some sources online claim it was actually 7 minutes and 46 seconds. And eventually Floyd stopped responding, and an hour later, after this incident, he was declared dead. This initiated widespread protests in numerous cities across America, including Minneapolis, where it occurred, and have been protests in over 2,000 towns and cities in over 60 countries. Now, this whole situation was reignited essentially following the shooting of Jacob Blake on the 23rd of August. Police were called to an incident whereby a woman reported her boyfriend was on her premises and wouldn't leave. Now, again, I'm leaving out most of the details here, but essentially the main point is police attempted to restrain David Blake, used a taser, and that failed. And then there is video footage, I won't show it here. He went round to his car door, leaned in, and was shot 7 times in the back. It's reported that he will most likely never walk again, and it was later proven that he did have, in fact, a knife in his possession. So now looking at the protest, it's important to point out that there are various sides to this. A lot of it's been simplified as a narrative I'm going to get to later, but there are numerous different levels of protest. There are some people who are merely calling for police reform, defunding the police, and end to systemic racism. Some protests have been violent and involved looting. Some protests saw police and protesters clash, as I saw police joining with protesters. I won't be going over the protests themselves in much detail, because again, that's not the point of this. I'm just going to be essentially presenting as many views as I can on these two sides. I will try to be as concise as possible, so if I do miss anything, please, again, let me know. This is a learning experience for myself as well. However, I'm going to start by presenting all of the arguments essentially in favour of the protests and on that essentially pro-protester side. It's a bit grey in the middle, but that's essentially, I'm going to just simplify it for this. The main side for this are peaceful protesters, the main group essentially, and they are merely seeking an end to systemic racism in America. They claim there is a problem with a lack of police accountability regarding violence, especially against members of ethnic minorities. Some have called for the defunding of the police. Some have merely been protesting to simply charge police with the crimes they claim they have committed. And again, it essentially revolves around this idea that people have the right to express their opinion and protest against the government, and that is all they are doing here. There is then a group beyond this, who are violent protesters, and the main arguments in favour of these violent protests are essentially that peaceful means haven't worked. We're still here, we've been doing peaceful protests since the days of Martin Luther King, and there's still racism in America, so a lot of people view it as a pent-up frustration that they're releasing against a state and a country that they believe has failed them. Other groups have claimed that it is done to force the establishment to act, that they clearly haven't listened, again, so we have to be violent to get our message across, and this government simply isn't listening. The main group essentially being portrayed around this is the Black Lives Matter organisation, and they have had many narratives in this, and essentially the main ones have been that if you don't actively support Black Lives Matter, then you are in fact part of the problem. There are many people claiming that it's not enough to just be a bystander. You can't simply not be racist yourself, you have to fight against it, and if you don't, you are in fact part of the problem. And then just a few more views regarding this side of the argument. Firstly is that police are being overly violent, they're using excessive force. Points have been proven using rubber bullets against peaceful protesters. The whole situation a few months ago where Donald Trump had police around the White House remove all the protesters so he could go and have a photo shoot in a church. There have been claims that police are in fact placing bricks and other objects of the sort in nearby to stores in order to essentially incite violence, that police have been joining protests to make them violent. Federal officers have been accused of arresting people without a warrant. So there's this view very much that the so-called opposition to the protesters are trying to sabotage their efforts by making it violent. There have also been reports that white supremacists in masks are going out and being violent. So there have been a lot of different views on that. Now moving on to the opposition to the protest. Firstly, are those opposed to violent protests. This is essentially the main group. The arguments put forth are that innocent people are being hurt. You see these examples of people unrelated to the protests having their stores looted and destroyed, having their lives ruined, and that in fact harms the message of the protesters. This is a big point, that being violent jeopardizes the idea that they are somehow the oppressed group, and there's a view that they have to be better than the violent police, that they have to be... Apologies if you can hear my dog, he's being very loud at the moment. So yeah, then the main view is that being violent harms the image of the protesters. How can they claim that they are the oppressed group when they are in fact being violent and lawless? There's also this kind of view that a lot of people claim that they're being counterproductive, because there's essentially this view that the idea is the establishment is racist against black people, which would imply that they have inherent views about whether they're violent or ignore law and order, and therefore by being violent and ignoring the law, they are essentially confirming this racist prejudice that a lot of people already have. So although this view is being criticised by some for not solving the problem, it merely addresses the idea that you can't claim to be the oppressed group when you yourself are stooping down to the same level as those you claim to be oppressed by. And this kind of narrative of a lack of law and order has been continued into Trump's rhetoric, which is that the police need to maintain law and order, that these protests are done by anarchists, and one of the main targets Trump has had for this rhetoric of anarchy is Antifa, which is an anti-fascist group based in America, and he listed them as a terrorist organisation, in fact, and he's been creating this idea, essentially, that Antifa and Black Lives Matter are behind these protests. They're using this, essentially, to bypass the rule of law and try to create this kind of anarchist state, because the one thing a lot of people have pointed out is that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement itself are self-proposed anarchists, and I believe socialists as well, and so they're using these protests as a cover to kind of push their anarchist socialist views. And this idea of combining protesters into groups has been used a lot by Trump, especially in terms of making them appear, whether they are or whether they aren't, as bad in a sense. And another idea that's kind of been floated around is this idea that the media has been skipping out on a lot of the details and trying to create this narrative that Trump's bad, protesters are good. For example, a lot of people have pointed out that George Floyd had a criminal past, and that should be taken into account, that Jacob Blake had a knife on him, that should be taken into account, and that links into this idea that Trump made about how sometimes policemen make mistakes, they only have a few seconds to make important decisions that could affect their safety, and so they make these errors, and that doesn't make them racist, it just makes them human in the fact that they make mistakes. And then finally, this kind of idea of armed militias, essentially that they're defending against the violent protesters, that they need to be there in order to help maintain law and order and prevent this anarchist group of protesters from destroying everything, which a lot of people claim they are doing. That, in a sense, covers the main ideas, I suppose, of the arguments for and against. I'll just go over now the overall kind of arching differing views and just list them, essentially. In regards to violent protests, those in support are using the main argument that it's pent-up frustration, that this is almost vengeance, in a sense, for years of being oppressed and suffering at the hands of a racist state. So they have to be violent, they have to get their message across. They've failed in every other way, so this is the last resort. While those on the other side take the complete opposite approach, in that it's harming their message, it's making it even harder to get their point across. When people just see violence and looting, they're making innocent people suffer, they're destroying things, they're really harming the message that they are the oppressed group when they act like that. Then in regards to Black Lives Matter, there's the idea that, in support of it especially, that they do need a bigger voice, that staying silent doesn't do anything, that they need people to actively support them if they are to make a change, and they can't just have it as it's been before where everyone else just stays silent. And some have been accused of hoping it kind of glosses over and they go back to as it was, but they essentially just say that staying silent doesn't do anything and they need to get their voice across. And then the counter to this is that Black Lives Matter are, in a sense, isolating themselves from potential supporters by claiming that they are then racist by not supporting them, and they're making the organisation itself far more isolated. They're turning away potential supporters and actually, again, being counterproductive to their cause. Then in regards to police using force, those opposed to it, that the police are being overly violent, that they turn the protests violent. They were originally peaceful, and that the police used force excessively. They shouldn't be doing it. They should be supporting the protests, and they're trying to silence them, essentially. While on the other side are pointing more to the violent protests, saying, this is why we need the police. There's a bit of a disagreement over which one caused the other, and in cases it's certainly not clear whether it was violence by the police causing violent protests or the police were a response to violent protests. But those in favour of the police using force are certainly taking the narrative that it was the violent protests that did it first, and simply the police are simply trying to maintain order and prevent a further descent into chaos. Then in regards to militias, many people against them would claim that they're lawless, that they're just as bad as the anarchist groups, there's no accountability, they can go around killing who they want. A 17-year-old was actually found to have killed people when he was part of his militias last week, so there's certainly a case that these are counterproductive, that they're just essentially, they're not there to maintain law and order, they're either racists trying to silence the voice of the oppressed, or they are just using it as an excuse to go out and try and intimidate people. Meanwhile, those defending the militias would claim that they are a reaction to the violent protests, that they're necessary because the police can't be everywhere. They're needed to essentially defend people's livelihoods and stores to prevent this chaotic situation, and that they were created by the violent protests, and until the violent protests are gone, they won't go. Then, in regards to looting, this is a bit more complicated because some people have taken the side that the looting is not all protesting and it's just been made to appear like protesters, and that it's in fact white supremacists. Even police have been accused of using this as an excuse to loot. People have come in from other cities and just essentially scapegoated and blamed the protesters when in fact they are a completely separate group. But then on the other side of that, some people are supporting the looting, claiming that it's repayment for hundreds of years of oppression, poverty and suffering that the black people of America have experienced. Meanwhile, on the other side, it's just this kind of general view that looting is bad, it's never good, it doesn't matter what you're protesting for and against, that you should never use protesting as an excuse to loot, and that these protests have in fact been harmed by this, and it's essentially just become an excuse to steal things. And then perhaps the biggest idea is this idea of Democrats versus Republicans. The Democrats have framed this, or trying to frame it, that they are defending human rights, the Republicans are racist, they're opposed to change, and that we need to stand by the protests and help encourage change into America to make it less racist. Meanwhile, Trump has really pressed home this idea that only through him law and order can be maintained, that Joe Biden and the Democrats are a party of anarchy and of chaos, and that he needs to be strong to prevent things getting worse. That's why he's framed this whole idea as essentially these anarchists against the state, and he's using this to try and maintain law and order, focus on other things such as church, family, work, trying to get over the pandemic, and he's essentially saying that these protests are just an excuse of people being violent and he needs to stop that. And these protests have been kind of simplified in many groups. Some have claimed it as racists versus protesters, some have claimed it as anarchists versus law and order. It's very complicated, so I've tried to essentially pick it apart and expose the main groups and the main ideas being pushed back and forth. It's a very complicated issue, and obviously I haven't had enough time to give it proper justice. So if there is anything you think I missed, could have gone over better, I got wrong, please feel free to let me know in the comments or on Twitter. Again, this is a learning experience for me, so I would love if you could help me out and just give me examples, give me constructive criticism on how to improve. But that has been my covering of this current situation. I will be uploading once a week. I'm still not sure of the schedule. I'm going to university soon, in a few weeks, so once I'm there and I know my schedule, I will be able to create a proper format. But until then, keep an eye out. There should be a new episode coming out on Monday, which I'm not entirely sure on yet, but it won't be contextual. It'll be based on a political view, and I'm going to try and split it 2 episodes a week, one on a political idea or viewpoint, another on a political or economic or social situation, and comparing views that way. So there'll be an episode on Monday, should be another one on Friday. If not, keep an eye out. I'll let you know when I post again. And thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all soon.